At 7:42 a.m. on October 14th, 2024, Greg Thompson stood in a hazelnut orchard near Yamhill, Oregon, watching his mechanical sweeper push nuts into windrows while rain began falling. Light drizzle that would become steady precipitation within 3 hours, according to the forecast. Knowing that wet hazelnuts collected from saturated ground would test above 12% moisture and require expensive forced air drying instead of natural ambient drying that saved 18 cents per pound in processing costs. 56 years old, third-generation hazelnut grower. 180 acres producing 360,000 pounds annually for Ferrero and confectionery markets. His vacuum harvester was scheduled to collect swept rows starting at 9 a.m. But rain-soaked nuts would need immediate transport to drying facilities already operating at 92% capacity with a 4-day backlog. And wet harvest penalties from his processor contract would reduce payment from $2.40 per pound to $2.16 per pound for moisture above specification, costing $86,400 across his expected harvest. Standard practice said, stop sweeping, wait for dry conditions to resume in 5 to 7 days, and accept delayed harvest. Thompson had 140 acres remaining with nuts on the ground, a narrow October to November window before winter rains made collection impossible. And Ferrero's quality inspector arriving November 2nd to verify delivery commitments. He radioed his vacuum operator. They'd harvest wet, pay for forced air drying at commercial facilities, and protect delivery schedules over processing cost optimization. Willamette Valley's hazelnut system operates as America's complete domestic production region. 75,000 acres producing 45,000 tons annually. WE's supplying 99% of U.S. hazelnut consumption through a unique harvest method, where nuts naturally fall from trees onto orchard floors swept clean, then collected by high-capacity vacuum machines that suction nuts directly into bulk bins, moving immediately to 20-plus processing facilities equipped with drying systems, reducing moisture from 10 to 15% harvest levels to 6 to 8% storage specifications. The dried nuts flow through cracking machines removing shells, sorting systems grading by size from 9 to 15 millimeters diameter. Blanching operations removing skins for confectionery applications, and roasting facilities preparing product for Nutella manufacturing, chocolate production, and bakery ingredient markets across North America, Europe, and Asia. This is agriculture dependent on ground harvest systems, where rainfall determines moisture levels. Processing capacity creates bottlenecks, and export contracts demanding specific size grades and moisture content connect Oregon orchards to Italian confectionery plants processing 80% of global hazelnut supply. Greg Thompson learned hazelnut farming from his father, who learned from his grandfather, who planted Oregon's first commercial hazelnut orchard in 1968, when the state was establishing itself as viable alternative to traditional Turkish and Italian production. His grandfather had harvested 40 acres manually, with crews using rakes and tarps, drying nuts in ambient air barns, selling to regional processors at commodity prices averaging $0.85 to $1.15 per pound. His father mechanized in 1988, purchasing the first vacuum harvester that eliminated hand-raking labor, and developed export relationships with European buyers paying premiums for Oregon's larger kernel sizes and lower defect rates. Thompson took over in 2002, expanded to 180 acres, and invested $840,000 in harvest equipment coordinating sweeping and vacuum collection systems while navigating processor consolidation that reduced independent facilities from 45 in 2000 to 20 in 2024, creating capacity constraints where harvest timing became as critical as growing expertise. The Floriate 5.0 vacuum harvester Thompson operated cost $285,000 new in 2019. The machine featured a 42-inch vacuum head that sucked nuts from windrows at rates of 3,000 pounds per hour, separating debris through air classification systems and loading cleaned nuts into 2,000-pound bulk bins. The harvester processed 12 to 15 acres daily when conditions allowed continuous operation. But rain created cascade failures. Wet nuts required forced drying. Drying facilities operated at capacity during peak harvest, and delays risked winter weather, making remaining nuts uncollectible. The system's efficiency in dry conditions became its vulnerability in wet years. The economics were export contract dependent and moisture sensitive. At Ferrero contract rates of $2.40 per pound for in-shell hazelnuts meeting 6 to 8% moisture and 11 to 13 millimeter kernel size specifications. Each acre yielding 2,000 pounds generated $4,800 in gross revenue. Tree maintenance costs ran $420 per acre for pruning, disease control, and nutrient management. Irrigation, $180 per acre for supplemental water during nut development. Pest management targeting filbert worm and aphids, $145 per acre. Harvest costs including sweeping and vacuum collection, $380 per acre. Drying and processing at ambient rates, 42 cents per pound or $840 per acre. Total costs, $1,965 per acre against $4,800 revenue, leaving $2,835 profit per acre. Across 180 acres, Thompson generated $864,000 in gross revenue and $510,300 in operating profit. After equipment depreciation and land costs, actual net income around $218,000. But if rain-forced wet harvest requiring commercial forced air drying at 60 cents per pound instead of 42 cents ambient drying, costs increased $360 per acre, reducing profit to $2,475 per acre. A 13% margin reduction costing $64,800 across the operation. If moisture penalties triggered contract downgrades to $2.16 per pound, revenue dropped to $4,320 per acre, and profit collapsed to $1,995 per acre. A 30% margin reduction costing $151,200. The difference between dry harvest and wet harvest was whether Thompson couldn't control and processing capacity he couldn't expand. At 9:40 a.m., the vacuum harvester had collected 18,000 pounds from the first 6 swept acres. The nuts were testing at 13.2% moisture, well above the 8% target for ambient drying. Thompson called 3 commercial drying facilities within 35 miles. 2 were at capacity with 5 to 6 day wait times. The third, a cooperative facility in McMinnville, had emergency capacity available at premium rates, 72 cents per pound for forced air drying versus the normal 42 cents for ambient. The premium drying would cost an additional $108,000 across his projected 360,000-pound harvest, but would prevent moisture-related contract penalties that would cost $151,200. Thompson accepted the McMinnville slot, then coordinated trucking to deliver wet nuts within 4 hours to prevent quality degradation from mold and rancidity development. His son Kevin arrived at 11:20 a.m. to help coordinate the multi-site logistics. 31 years old, holding an agricultural economics degree from Oregon State. He'd worked the operation for 6 years while increasingly questioning whether hazelnut farming generated adequate returns for the capital intensity and weather vulnerability involved. Kevin had calculated that the operation deployed $3.2 million in land and equipment to generate $218,000 net income, a 6.8% return on assets that barely justified the risk compared to alternative investments or leasing land to larger growers consolidating acreage. Dad, we're paying $108,000 in emergency drying costs because rain came during harvest. The trees are healthy, the nuts are quality, the agronomics were perfect. But weather timing destroyed 50% of our profit margin. That's hazelnut farming. We can control cultivation. We can't control October weather or processing capacity. Then maybe the business model doesn't work for mid-sized operations anymore. Large growers running 800+ acres have dedicated drying infrastructure and can absorb wet years. And we're completely dependent on commercial facilities that prioritize their own members first. Thompson understood. His son was identifying the structural vulnerability that no amount of farming skill could overcome. Hazelnut production had evolved into an industry where post-harvest infrastructure mattered more than orchard management, and capital requirements for processing independence exceeded what family operations could finance sustainably. By October 28th, Thompson had completed harvest of all 180 acres. Total production, 348,000 pounds at average 12.8% moisture requiring forced air drying. Processing costs at McMinnville premium rates, $250,560 versus budgeted $146,160 for ambient drying. The $104,400 cost overrun, combined with moisture-related contract downgrades reducing payment to $2.22 per pound, meant final revenue of $772,560 against operating costs of $567,210. Operating profit, $205,350 versus projected $510,300. After fixed costs, net income $92,180 versus projected $218,000. The wet harvest had consumed 58% of expected earnings. Greg Thompson continued hazelnut farming through 2026, managing weather windows and processing constraints while watching margins compress as drying costs increased 22%, and contract prices remained flat. In spring 2027, Ferrero announced new sourcing requirements. Hazelnut suppliers must deliver minimum 800,000 pounds annually beginning in 2028, a 130% increase over Thompson's current 348,000-pound production. And meeting the requirement meant expanding to 400 acres and investing $1.6 million in dedicated on-farm drying infrastructure, preventing future commercial facility dependencies. He met with Kevin in April 2027 to discuss expansion feasibility. The analysis was stark. $1.6 million drying investment plus land acquisition costs against current net income of $92,000 to $218,000 annually meant 8 to 12-year payback periods. At age 56, Thompson would be 68 before recovering investment. Kevin had zero interest in inheriting debt-financed expansion into an industry where processor consolidation and volume requirements systematically eliminated mid-sized growers. Kevin, we either expand to meet Ferrero's minimum and build drying independence, or we exit hazelnut contracts and compete in bulk commodity markets at $1.85 per pound instead of $2.40. Dad, both options depend on processor terms we don't control. Expansion locks us into Ferrero dependency. Commodity markets mean competing with Turkish imports at half our production costs. Greg Thompson sold his 180-acre hazelnut operation to a regional nut company managing 1,200 acres across Yamhill and Washington counties in fall 2027. The sale, $16,000 per acre for mature Barcelona variety orchards, plus $420,000 for equipment, generated $3.3 million gross. After settling debt, Thompson netted $1.8 million. Kevin took a position with Oregon State University Extension as a tree crop specialist, using his agricultural economics education and family hazelnut knowledge to advise growers on the consolidation trends that had consumed his family's operation. Willamette Valley's 75,000 acres continue producing 45,000 tons of hazelnuts annually. He's supplying 99% of U.S. consumption, processing through 20 facilities operating forced air drying systems, sorting by 9 to 15 millimeter diameter specifications, and shipping to Ferrero, confectionery manufacturers, and bakery ingredient processors. The mechanical sweepers push ground-fallen nuts into windrows regardless of farm ownership. The vacuum harvesters collect nuts regardless of who planted the orchards. The processing infrastructure operates regardless of which families developed the cultivation systems. The industry persists through efficiency that family operations pioneered, but can no longer sustain profitably at scales too small for processing infrastructure, independence, and volume commitments processors now demand. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us preserve these histories of American agriculture's transformation. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and whether you understand the processing infrastructure pressures crushing specialty tree crop growers. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.